Good morning. Good morning and welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell to you today. She is the 10th president of Spelman College, founded in 1881 in Atlanta, Georgia, as the fourth. Welcome, Spelman. That was so much fun. I'd almost like to just start from the top and do it again. And I should add that I'm Mary Miller. I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute. So let's go back. Spelman College, founded in 1881 in Atlanta, Georgia, as the fourth college in the United States, specifically founded to educate African American women. For a quick perspective, this was remarkably 5 years after the end of Reconstruction and 2 years after the founding of Radcliffe College. The Spelman name redounds with meaning these days, as in all days. Stacey Abrams, 95, whose career in politics is just beginning. Others of you will know the difference that Marion Wright Edelman, of an earlier generation, has made in the lives of the difference that she has made in the lives of children everywhere, earning her a MacArthur Fellowship and a Presidential Medal of Honor. These women are exemplary of the women that Spelman has nurtured and launched. So the weight on the shoulders of Mary Schmidt Campbell is not small. Let me tell you a bit more about our speaker. I hope it's okay for me to say, and I actually have to tell you, I was nervous enough about this that I asked our speaker if it was okay for me to say that she was kind of a kid when in 1977 she became executive director of the Studio Museum of Harlem. During her tenure, Dr. Campbell steered the museum from a struggling startup in a loft over a liquor store to a 60,000 square foot building and into the nation's premier Black fine arts museum with an annual $2 million budget. Then, still kind of a kid, Dr. Campbell became commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, a post she held until becoming dean of the Tisch School of Arts at New York University in 1991. And she transformed that program in terms of the programs offered during her sustained tenure. Along the way, she chaired the committee that laid the foundations for the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. Yeah, just that. Just a little job. Here at the Getty, we have been benefiting from our relationships with the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, the only museum in the world that emphasizes art by and about women of the African diaspora. And our relationship has been particularly instrumental to the launch of the Getty's African American Initiative about a year ago. Now the Spelman Museum has launched, in collaboration with the Department of Art and Art History there, a 2-year curatorial studies program to increase diversity in the museums of the world. In this, we see the hand of Mary Schmidt Campbell, who has pulled the thread of her first position at the Studio Museum of Harlem to connect to new programs she has envisioned for Spelman that encompass art, visual history, and science. Today, Dr. Campbell will speak to us about her new book, Romare Bearden, An American Odyssey. If you haven't read it, I can recommend it from the bottom of my heart. I started it last weekend and I finished it last night around 1 in the morning. She has been studying and researching and thinking about Romare Bearden since the days of her doctoral work, when she first knew that she wanted to change the way that the very story of art in the United States would be told, turning to the works of Bearden, Betty Saar, and Jacob Lawrence, among many others. Bearden wrote that working with fragments of the past brings them into the now. Well, now we welcome all of you to the Getty today, friends, new friends, council members, and more. And we welcome Dr. Campbell to take us to both past and now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that warm welcome, Mary. And I really do appreciate your lifting up Spelman College. I think I know that Spelman College is in the house. Do I have Spelman alumni? Let's stand. Ask all the Spelman alumni to stand. We are so excited about the partnership that we are forging with the Getty. And you're right, we aim to transform the entire Atlanta University Center into a place that is going to be the incubator for professionals of color for the museum world. So thank you for entering into this partnership with us. We're very proud that you're here. And I also want to take a moment and introduce my Spelman College trustee, Dr. Walter Allen, a professor at UCLA. Thank you. Thanks very much for being here with us. So when I tell people that I've written a biography of Romare Bearden, typically I get two questions. The first is, who's Romare Bearden? And the second is, well, why did you write a book about him? And in answering that question, I always refer to the playwright August Wilson. August Wilson has said, when somebody handed him this catalog, it's the catalog of Romare Bearden's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, his first retrospective in New York. He said he was sitting at a kitchen table and he opened up the book and he said his entire vision for his 10-play cycle came into focus. And this is what he said about the work. What I saw was Black life presented on its own terms with all its richness and fullness in a language made attendant to everyday life, ennobled it, affirmed its value, and exalted its presence. In that catalog, August Wilson would have seen a woman sitting in a chair represented as Sheba, regal and monarchical. He would have looked at a representation of a Palm Sunday processional and seen the way it evoked a 6th century Byzantine processional. He would have seen African-American women represented with unabashed appreciation for their beauty and sensuality. And he also would have seen pieces of incredible complexity. The piece that you're looking at now is actually quite small. It looks like it's really large, right? It's about this size. It's very, very small. And it was the first collage that Bearden exhibited publicly. He exhibited it for a fundraiser for the Congress on Racial Equality in the spring of 1964. And it was the first hint of the collages that would come to make him famous. And I write about that collage the following. Space is cluttered, overstuffed. A man sits at a table laden with food. A young boy, a son, maybe a grandson, sits beside him as a woman stands across the table with a heaping platter of food. At first glance, the collage depicts a familiar routine. A Black family sits down for a meal. Yet, bodies are disjoint. The woman's face is an accordion of 3 photographic strips. Shirley Temple, a white woman, a Black woman, and a slice of an ancient African artifact. Half of the body of the Black man, the eponymous Prophet Peterson, is composed of the clothes of a working man. The other half, an inchoate jumble of disparate fragments. Half of his face is intact and looks cheerfully out of the picture as if extending an invitation. The other half is an incomprehensible combination of elements. The setting Bearden has constructed, like a hastily assembled puzzle, is a clash of incongruities. On the left, a black and white news clipping of a white man in a business suit is plastered to the wall. On the right wall is what looks like a yearbook photograph of a young black woman. A white Santa grins cheerfully from a television screen. Bearden has made use of a snippet of a reproduction of a painting, a formal chandelier to define its improbable presence as a lighting fixture in the down-at-the-heels interior. He represents the food of the meal as magazine clippings and the jarring combination of white woman, black woman, African artifact, television image, photos of a suited white man and a young black woman, snippets of painting all jammed into a cramped space create the explosiveness of cultural collision. Who was this artist who could assemble so many disparate elements in his work into a unified visual text? It was clear that in anchoring his vision in Black culture, he was also making a larger statement about culture in general. So why did I write this book? Well, I did want to tell the story of Romare Bearden. He was born in 1911 in Charlotte, North Carolina. He died in New York City in 1988. So that meant his life spanned the entire 20th, practically the entire 20th century. And he was born into the home of his great-grandparents. That's Bearden on the right in the little dress. And that's his great-grandfather, H.B. Kennedy, standing next to his great-grandmother, Rosa Kennedy, who stands next to his grandmother, Catherine Kennedy. And as you can see, they're very well-dressed, prosperous family. H.B. and Rosa were born slaves. And so what I could see from Bearden's life was the perspective of African Americans moving from enslavement to freedom, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the Great Migration North, through the Depression, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. And that in telling the story of Bearden's life, I could also tell the story of the evolution of Black citizenship and Black culture in this country in the 20th century and beyond into the 21st century. Now, this first section of the book is entitled Terms of the Debate. And part of the story that I tell that is the larger narrative is the fact that as Bearden was coming of age and developing as a visual artist, this country was engaged in a battle of images. Now, mundane and I write about this particular photograph, mundane as the photograph might seem, it was a vital record of the family status at a time when visual images were fast asserting power and influence. Just as the Kennedys and others were enjoying the fruits of their new entitlements as citizens, there was a backlash, turn-of-the-century vitriol that fueled verbal and written debates about the millions of newly enfranchised Black citizens. Bearden's family had much to lose or gain from the debate. Advertisements for everyday products, sheet music, theater, the new medium of moving pictures and photographs, especially the macabre practice of photographing the lynching of Black citizens, attempted to reduce the industriousness of families like the Kennedys and Beardens to allegories of sloth, or worse, a threat to the moral order. American visual politics was a battlefield. Representation was a matter of life and death and not just art. So, as the Kennedys were photographing themselves and documenting their success, their prosperity, their respectability, as you can see from the slide on your left, artists like Thomas Nast, for example, a very popular cartoonist, were producing images that were demeaning, that were caricatures. As Bearden's family continued and other African Americans continued to document, and I will say that during this period, photography was very popular among African Americans, and the number of African American photographers grew quite rapidly from the late 19th century into the 20th century. And so this idea of authoring yourself became very popular on the part of African American citizens. But at the same time, not only cartoonists, but artists like Currier and Ives were producing prints by the thousands, the tens of thousands, and gaining popularity. Even the new medium of film got into the picture. The country's first blockbuster was Birth of a Nation. And what was Birth of a Nation? It was an absolutely demeaning representation of African Americans as a threat to the moral order and a danger to the future of the country, and a celebration of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. If you want interesting commentary on that, I would suggest you look at Spike Lee's recent film, Black Klansman. And as I mentioned, the most macabre visual representation was the practice not only of lynching. Lynching itself was bad enough, but it was accompanied by the practice of photographing the event, selling the photographs, turning them into postcards and mailing them, or putting them on display. So this notion of visual images having power was one that proliferated in the early 20th century and only grew as the means to produce and distribute those images increased through film, television, and other mediums. But Bearden was lucky. And by that I mean that his family migrated to Harlem several years after his birth. And he had the good fortune to move to Harlem at a time when Harlem was the Black cultural capital of the world. This is a photograph of Romie when he's about 6 years old. He's a little mop head standing between his great-grandfather and his great-grandmother, and behind him is his mother and his father. To his father's left is his grandmother, and to his mother's right is his aunt. And this was taken, about the time that this was taken, it was probably taken in Charlotte, but by this time, the Beardens are living in New York City, and New York City is a place, Harlem is a place of incredible visual pageantry. The image you're looking at now is the silent parade that was organized in 1917. It's the first major mass protest by African Americans. And James Weldon Johnson, who was one of the organizers, said he wanted a protest that was going to be as visually stunning as it was politically important. And so he had the thousands of protesters, the women dressed in white, the men dressed in their suits and their boaters, and they walked down Fifth Avenue in New York to the sound of a muffled drum. This notion of visual pageantry being connected to political issues and social issues was extremely popular. Probably the most popular example of that is Marcus Garvey and his United Negro Improvement Association, which was a movement to organize and send African Americans back to Africa. But there were many different mediums in which visual images of African Americans proliferated, and one was film. This is an advertisement of a film by Oscar Micheaux, a Black filmmaker who made scores of film. The interesting thing about it is if you look at who was in the cast, you can see Bessie Bearden, Bearden's mother, had a small role in this 1921 film, which is now lost, but we at least have the advertisement. But it tells us how prolific, how ubiquitous these visual images were for Bearden as a young child as he was growing up. And then, of course, there was his mother, Bessie Bearden. Bessie Bearden was a force of nature. When she came to Harlem, she found her voice, she found her place in the world. She joined a number of clubs. She became a correspondent for the Chicago Defender. And in those days, the Black press was incredibly popular, had huge circulation. And she was a correspondent with the Chicago Defender from 1927 to 1943. She became chairman of one of the local school boards. She eventually became a deputy tax collector. But probably the two most important things she did is, one, she had a salon in her home. And people like W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Fats Waller would come over and hang out in the Beardens' living room. So Bearden was always surrounded by these intellectuals, by people who were masters of art and music, and so he was in a space that gave him an extraordinary education. The other important thing she did is remembering that women have recently gotten the vote, and she became active in politics and was part of the drive to persuade African Americans to leave the Republican Party, because back in those days, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, and so African Americans overwhelmingly were Republican, but she persuaded them to leave the Republican Party and move to the Democratic Party, which was essential in getting FDR elected. So she had real political power. She had real social persuasion, and Bearden grew up in the middle of this. Her hopes for her son, of course, her only son, was that he would be a doctor. And so she sent him to Lincoln University, which was still is a very well-known HBCU. Lincoln is right outside of Philadelphia. But early on, we can see that Bearden had other things in mind. He's listed as a cartoonist on the masthead of one of the literary magazines. He ended up going to 3 colleges. He left Lincoln after his first year. He entered in 1929, which is, of course, the year of the Depression, left there, went to Boston University, played varsity baseball, and he was so good that he was recruited by a professional team. But he turned them down because they required him to pass for white, because in those days, baseball was completely segregated. He refused. He left Boston University after 2 years and finally came to New York University, where he eventually graduated in 1935. And when he got out of New York University, he came into a Harlem that was thriving intellectually and artistically. Because despite the Depression, and the Depression was really tough in Harlem, the unemployment rate was 33% in the country at large and 50% in Harlem. But despite that, there was the New Deal and the Works Project administration. And because of that, it allowed African American artists to make a living, or at least to support themselves, to supplement their living, and begin to create art in a way that created a whole community of artists and bodies of works by artists. So Bearden grew up at a time when this work was being done. It was being publicly exhibited at libraries, at eventually an art center. And I want to say one more thing about Bearden's life after he graduated. He immediately got a job as a caseworker. Now, his caseload was Harlem. So that meant that he had to serve many of the residents of Harlem who had lost their jobs, who were at risk of eviction, who were suffering health issues as a result of the unsanitary conditions that they had to live in some of the tenements in Harlem. He had a full-time job, which he held for 30 years. So he would do his job, come home, take off his work clothes, and go to his studio and work. And he did that for 30 years. So what you're seeing for the next several slides that are his work, just bear in mind that this is work that he was producing, serious body of work that he was producing, and also maintaining a full-time job. But when he comes out of college, he's surrounded by artists like Aaron Douglas, who was who was producing monumental work. This is an example of one of his murals. He had the advantage of artists like Augusta Savage, who had a studio right there in Harlem and who would open it up and allow young artists to come in and work with her under her supervision. And he had artists like Jacob Lawrence, who were his peers, who were doing major, in Lawrence's case, major series based on African-American figures. And Lawrence, in fact, had reached the status of where his work, Migration, the Migration series, had been bought by two major museums, the Museum of Modern Art and the Phillips Collection, which couldn't agree on who would get what, so they just split the series down in half, and one got half and the other got the other half. But he was surrounded by these wonderful, wonderful artists, so it really was a very vibrant community. Now, all of this was going on during the day, but then there was Harlem at night. And Harlem at night may have been even more rich and instructive for him than Harlem during the day. This is a map of Harlem around the 1930s that was done by the cartoonist E. Sims Campbell. And just to orient yourself, 131st Street is up top, and as you come down, you're going north. So 134th is here, and then 138th is down here. If you look up, you see to your left, Lafayette Theater. You have to remember that Bearden's parents' apartment was right behind the Lafayette Theater. He could put his head out the window and he can see the artists coming out of the Lafayette Theater. But as you can see, virtually every inch is covered either with a big performance space like Connie's Inn or the Cotton Club or the Savoy Ballroom, or these little juke joints and late night places. But it was a rich, thriving place where musicians played and performers played and vocalists sang, and entertainers were a magnet for people to come from all over the world to Harlem. I called it a cultural demilitarized zone. So in a highly segregated time during this country, Harlem was that place where people could come and enjoy some of that cultural crossing. And it could be really very sophisticated. This is a marquee from the Lafayette Theater for a Macbeth. It was called Voodoo Macbeth, that was directed by Orson Welles. So, and it was a big deal. It was a very popular production, and it was part of the Federal Theater program. Of course, there were the nightclubs, the Cotton Club. The performances is Cab Calloway and some of the Quarines who danced with him. And it was very clear as you study the cabaret scene of Harlem that it was a place for a lot of inventiveness, some transgressive behaviors, some experimentation, but it was a real lively, creative space. Gladys Bentley, for example, who was a male impersonator, was one of Bearden's favorites. And then, of course, there was the international favorite, Josephine Baker, who performed in Harlem and on Broadway, and eventually went to Paris and became inspiration for artists all over the world. So, in fact, as a young man, Bearden was surrounded with this treasure trove of visual images and visual culture that really functioned as a counter-narrative to all of the negative images that were also swirling around in our culture. It's not surprising that when he did get around to becoming a serious artist, that he was very much what I call a race man. This is from an article that he wrote in 1934. He was still a student at NYU. And he makes a very positive statement about the relationship between his art and race. If it is the race question, the social struggle, or whatever else needs expression, it is to that the artist must surrender himself. An intense, eager devotion to present-day life, to study it, to help relieve it. This is the calling of the Negro artist. So he thinks of himself as an artist, a Negro artist who has this calling to represent everyday life. And so when he gets around to actually producing art, he begins as a cartoonist. And he worked as a cartoonist for several years, mostly for the Baltimore Afro-American. And this is very typical of one of the cartoons that he would draw. This of a Ku Klux Klan looming over masses, and the Black Legion is another sort of Ku Klux Klan-like organization that brought domestic terror to African Americans. And he minces no words. He likens the Ku Klux Klan to the rise of fascism. And that appears very often in the cartoons that he did of that period. He even has a cartoon where he questions whether or not African Americans should enlist in the army. And he cites as the reason the fact that they went to World War I, fought bravely, returned, and faced the same conditions of segregation. And so he was really a fairly radical artist as a cartoonist. Around the late 1930s, he stops doing cartoons and he switches to painting, and he thinks of himself now seriously as a painter. We know that in the summer of 1933, he went to study with the German artist George Gross at the Art Students League. And Gross was an artist who literally risked his life criticizing the rise of fascism. He escaped Germany. The Nazis stripped him of his citizenship, and he couldn't go back. So Bearden was studying with someone who understood the power that visual images could have in terms of disrupting or critiquing a political regime. So he studied with Gross, and Gross began to introduce him to European artists, to the idea of copying art, to looking at artists, if he was doing cartoons, looking at satirical artists like Daumier, or looking at artists like Kathy Kollwitz. And Bearden decided that what he wanted was to be a serious artist, and so he dropped his cartoons and began doing paintings. And the paintings are pretty reflective of many themes that you would see during the Depression. I do want to call your attention to the image that's up at the top of the screen. This is from the catalog of his first exhibition in 1940. And that piece is of a man's sort of enlarged face with a piece of paper in his hand as if he's giving someone a pink slip, and a woman, sort of clutching her child. Just remember that image. We're going to see it a little bit later in the slideshow. But these works were good, not great, pretty conventional. Probably the one that got the most attention for him during this period was Factory Workers. It was reproduced in Fortune magazine with an article on unemployment. Then Bearden enlists in the Army for World War II. And that's a turning point for him. His mother dies. There are more riots in Harlem. There's a riot in 1943. He goes into an army that is strictly segregated. After hanging out in Harlem and being part of this scene, he goes into an army that is absolutely strictly segregated, and he hated it. He decides while he's in the army, while he's doing his work in the army, that he is going to drop any subject matter having to do with race. And his art becomes totally and completely abstract. And he not only stops representing Black people, he also begins to pick up themes that for him, he believes are universal. This is He is Risen from the Bible. He has themes also from the poet Garcia Lorca. He'll take themes from Rabelais or from the Iliad. And he also you begin to see his reliance on these European paintings that he's been studying and copying. And he absorbs the compositions into his own works. And he begins to think of himself not as a Negro artist, but as an artist. And he writes this in an article called The Negro Artist's Dilemma. It is the privilege of the oppressor to depict the oppressed. Consequently, the picture of the Negro was that of a shiftless, dim-witted buffoon. This concept was one of the means of keeping the Negro in his dark corner. He makes that observation, and he says basically in this article, I'm not even going to be in that debate. I'm not going to represent African Americans or Black culture at all. I'm going to be not primarily a Negro artist, but an artist. And for the next 20 years of his life, basically, he made paintings that were essentially either figurative abstractions or totally abstract. And I've often thought, so what if he had died, after that? We would have known Romare Bearden as a completely different artist from the artist he eventually became. But it was important, really important for me to look very carefully at this transition, because it seemed to me that he was really having an argument with himself about what his relationship would be as an artist to his race as a Black man. Another example of his work of this period. During this period, he had artistic success. He was invited to become part of a gallery, a downtown gallery. Some of the other artists were some of the budding abstract expressionists like Robert Motherwell and Adolf Gottlieb. So he found success with this approach to the arts. However, in 1948, that gallery, it was called the Coots Gallery, closed. A year later, they reopened, and they reopened without him. So now he's found himself. Harlem has pretty much dissipated as a community after World War II. He's now no longer a part of the Coots Gallery. And he began to find himself in a place where he was very isolated and frankly very lonely. And one of his fellow artists, Carl Holte, suggested that he use his GI Bill and go live in Paris. And that's exactly what he did. So in the spring of 1950, he takes a boat, he sails to Paris. Because he's on the GI Bill, he has to enroll formally into an educational program, so he enrolls in a PhD program at the Sorbonne. But if you look at the photographs of Bearden in Paris, clearly he didn't spend too much time sitting in his classrooms. That's him with the hat on, and there are many photographs like that. He had the time of his life. Because he got to Paris, James Baldwin was there, and he would go to Baldwin's house, and he'd listen to Baldwin read from Go Tell It on the Mountain. He'd walk down the streets, and he'd hear jazz in the middle of the night, and he'd go and find, a group of jazz musicians playing. He got to go into the studios of Brancusi and Elion and Picasso and Leger, and he loved it. He didn't paint while he was there, but he loved it. So his 5 months were up, he comes back to New York, and he decides the thing he wants to do is to save all his money and go back to Paris. So he does not go back to painting. He takes up songwriting. And he decides, and he's pretty good at it. Billy Eckstine records one of his songs. Seagram's picks it up as part of an advertising campaign. He writes through the Fulbright Foundation. He tries to get a Fulbright to go back, but nothing is working for him. He's painting intermittently. He's trying to go back to Paris. He tries forming a studio in his own studio, and so other artists can come, trying to recapture that sense of community. This is Bearden in his studio. Oh, by the way, I should tell you that his studio was above the Apollo Theater. That's the photograph of the Apollo. It's a nice place for a studio, right? A little distracting, but he had his studio, and we know that he was at least doing sketches. We have now found, in the course of writing the book, found some wonderful sketches that he did during this period, but this really was quite intermittent. And finally, he tells the story, and he's told it in many different occasions. He was walking down the street, and he just stopped on the sidewalk, wrapped his arms around a fire hydrant, and just collapsed. And of course, he had a breakdown and was hospitalized at Bellevue. Came out, and fortunately met an extraordinary woman by the name of Nanette Rohan. Nanette was a model. These are some of the ads that she appeared in for Vaseline, and I think that one's for Colgate. But she was actually on television. She was on television commercials. She was a dancer. She was a very sensitive, creative woman. And they got married, and she recognized right away that what he needed to do was go back to painting. Stop the songwriting, stop figuring out how to get back to Paris. And when they married, he was living with his father, who was a widower. She said, and you got to move out from your father. So he goes back to painting, and she has some connections. She gets him his first solo exhibition in New York City at the Barone Gallery in 1955. But in the late 1950s, early 60s, Bearden meets the gallery dealer who would really change his life, and that was Arne Ekstrom. And Ekstrom was opening a brand new gallery in New York, and he chose Bearden as the first artist to present at his new gallery. And these are large, beautiful, gorgeous abstract paintings that Bearden did for the Ekstrom Gallery. And Bearden had a couple of shows there, and he got great reviews. Once again, he was at the top of his game. In fact, President John F. Kennedy, when he was decorating his inaugural suite, put one of Bearden's paintings in there. You can see that he's standing in front of the painting that's on the right. So Bearden had it all. He had kind of regained his balance, and he was ready to continue as an artist. And then the civil rights movement surged. And I say in the book that Bearden kind of came late to the civil rights movement. And by that I mean that there were many artists who were already there in the late 50s, early 60s. I think I see Betty Saar sitting here. There she is, like Betty Saar. I think we should all applaud Betty Saar, because she's like really extraordinary. But they were already exploring the nature of visual images and representation and their meaning in the context of this new surge for citizenship on the part of our community and on part of our country in general. Bearden came to the civil rights movement when A. Philip Randolph called him on the phone and said, listen, we're doing this March on Washington in 1963, and I'd like to have some artists there. And so Bearden got with Hale Woodruff, Norman Lewis, Charles Alston, and they gathered together a group of artists, and what came out of it was a group called Spiral. And in Spiral, the artists would get together on a regular basis, and they'd talk about their art. They talked about whether it was important, whether it was abstract or not abstract. And a couple of the artists said that Bearden used to come to the meetings with a bag full of clippings. Magazine clippings, photographs, and he tried to get the artists to do a group collage. And he said nobody was interested. He said, no, collage, who needs it? It turns out that he had been experimenting with collage even as early as 1955-56. This is one of the early experiments. You remember I pointed to the image in his first exhibition. This was a gift he gave to a playwright in 1957, which is a collage of an earlier piece that he had done in 1940. And the name of the play was A Land Beyond the River. And this was the earliest example of the kinds of collages that he would come to do as a mature artist. So he had been thinking about this for a while. And it led him to what he would eventually call the prevalence of ritual. Now, I showed you this image a little bit earlier. This is the one that he did for Congress on Racial Equality. He was making more collages like that, and again, this collage is very small, it's very tiny, so the intensity of all these small pieces and cut pieces and photographs is really extraordinary. And an artist came in, one of the Spiral artists came into a studio and said, you know what? You really ought to photograph that and maybe blow it up. And that's what he did. He photographed photographed it, blew it up, and when his dealer came in and Bearden was trying to show him all of his abstract works, he looked at this piece and he said, "What's that?" Bearden said, "Oh, that's just something I'm, just playing around with." He said, "No, that's your next exhibit." And so his next exhibit was called Projections. And so the power of these images, photographed and blown up, they were called projections, had the feeling of being projections. And one of the most stunning things about these images to me is the way Bearden has shifted the relationship between the viewer and the object. Usually we go and we stand in front of something and we look at it and we're voyeurs. It's like people are doing something back there in the picture plane and we're just showing up and watching them. But in this case, he has the people in his paintings, in his projections, watching us. And the effect is riveting. This is Mysteries. This is one of my favorite from the projections, of 5 women in a shack in the South, going about the ritual of preparing food. The multi-generational sweep of this, the introduction of the fragments of African antiquity into their faces, the extraordinary beauty of the women that he really projects onto us. I also love the fact that Bearden could mix Southern themes with Northern themes. This is an urban theme. If you look at the image, up in the right-hand corner, you'll see 2 figures standing on the building. Bearden has said that it is he and Al Murray. Al Murray is a wonderful writer, and he and Bearden were very close, and he said that they were standing on the roof of Al Murray's apartment building, which is Lenox Terrace, looking down at a vision of what they saw as the cultural clash and collision of urban life. And what's phenomenal about this piece is this is 1964, and he's got planes falling out of the sky into buildings. It is a piece that stands for the kind of divisiveness that has plagued our country over and over and over again at different times in history. So although it was made in 1964, it has, still a very contemporary feel to it. And others recognized Bearden's sense of the urban pulse. So the Time magazine from 1968 commissioned him to do a piece on the troubles that Mayor Lindsay was having in the city of New York. The mayor was facing a huge strike on the part of teachers, sanitation workers, police officers. And so Bearden represents this whole, in almost the same way that he did his projections, represents the state of the mayor of the city of New York. He did large, beautiful murals of urban scenes. This is from one that he did for his, his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1970. It's 18 feet long and 12 feet high. It's huge, just huge. And when you're in front of it, you just get the feeling that you are swept up into the landscape that he has represented in a two-dimensional space. He also began at this point, by the end of the 1960s, he begins to collaborate with any number of artists. He collaborates with filmmakers. This is a collaboration with the dancer, choreographer Diane McIntyre. He collaborated with the late Ntozake Shange, with Derek Walcott, with musicians, with poets, Jane Cortez. It is wonderful. It's almost like it's liberating for him. And it also gets him into many, many other different mediums. And this is the one with Diane McIntyre. Also, by the end of the 1960s, he does away with the black and white taking black and white photographs of his collages and deals almost entirely with collage and color, with also limiting the number of photographs that he puts in his images. So, and relies over and over again on themes and motifs from Black life that he will connect from time to other eras and other cultures. So the ritual of baptism, his recollection of the performances during Harlem's cabaret scenes. The conjure woman is a figure that he comes to over and over and over again. And I always say that the conjure woman meant a lot to him because he was surrounded by all these powerful women, and that's what they felt like to him, some sorcerers, kind of mysterious women. He sees relationships between classical literature and Black culture, and he comes back to the Odyssey many times. He does the Odyssey in collage, he does it in watercolor, he does sketches of it, but that theme of taking a perilous journey, going on a voyage with lots of obstacles, and then finding your way home, always seemed to me to be a symbol of his entire life. He mixes up the theme of the conjure woman with the figure of Circe in this collage. And towards the end of his life, he comes to do autobiographical series. And these are some of my favorite collages by Bearden, because he takes a look at that long period of his life. He goes to the 1920s and he goes to the 1930s, and he uses his autobiographical series to kind of reveal all the richness of his past, and to give a sense of how that past can inform the future. This is an example from his collage, his autobiographical series from the 1920s. It's Model Sleet working in her garden. Another one from the South, watching the good trains go by. Trains were an important motif in his work. His grandfather's property was right next to the trains. His grandfather was a mail agent for the trains. Trains could take you from the South to the North. They bridged cultures. They were ways of taking you away and bringing you back, so the train is an extremely important motif. Pittsburgh was an important part of Bearden's life. His mother was very busy, and so twice during his childhood, Bearden went to go live with his grandparents in Pittsburgh. And while he was there, he met a young man named Eugene, who was absolutely brilliant at drawing what he saw. And what he saw was where he lived. And he lived in a brothel. And so he taught Bearden how to draw by showing him all the pictures that he had seen of what he saw in the brothel. And his grandmother thought, oh, isn't this nice? The two little boys are sitting together making pictures, until she picked one up and saw what they were drawing. But Eugene was a very frail child, and eventually he died. And this is an image of Eugene's funeral. And I bring this up because the notion of Bearden's inspiration for art coming from this child, understanding art as something that is kind of part of your DNA, part of a sort of an impulse, something that drives you, was something he seemed to have gotten from Eugene, and he pays homage to Eugene over and over again, and this is one of the collages that does pay tribute to the young Eugene. And Bearden as an adult represents sex workers in many different versions of his collages. It's a theme he comes back to, and it's one of the things I talk about in the book. Here's a man who, in the words of August Wilson, represented African Americans with nobility and with an exalted presence. But it is also true that Bearden has a striking number of paintings that are not only erotic, but kind of verge on the pornographic. And a scholar by the name of Judith Wilson talked about this in an article that she wrote. And when she published the article, she was not permitted to publish any of the visual images that she wanted that went along with it. But it's part of the sort of interesting contradictions that go along with looking at an artist's life's work. And of course, he celebrates all the time that he spent in the cabarets in New York and the Lafayette. And this is an image of Johnny Hudgens, who was a very famous performer, who performed actually in France as well in the 1920s, and also was an incredible performer back in Harlem. And what Bearden says about this painting is that he said that he could get on stage and create an entire world. And you could forget everything that was outside of that world. He just drew you into that. And for me, that's what Bearden's work is about. It's about world making. That he creates a world in which he wants to show us Black culture, Black life, and he wants to show us that life in relationship to other cultures. You can see behind his elbow a fragment from Duccio's Maesta. You can see on the sketch, perhaps down here, and maybe you can't see it so well, but there's a sketch of a Benin head. He wants to see our culture, have us see our culture as having many dense layers, being related to other cultures, being the product of cultural clashes, but also being the product of lived experience. And here he represents himself as a painter in the studio with his model as well. And what I love about this image, it's a self-portrait, and it's a very big painting. And it's a very, very big painting, very beautiful painting with lots of texture and different fragments of different things in here, tinfoil and threads. You can't see it in the slide at all. But what I love is that his face is almost blank. And if you get real close, you can see that he's barely sketched it. And I always love that sense that he's representing himself in a constant state of becoming. And that's what his life was for me, this constant state of invention and discovery and becoming. And I'll end by saying that, on a personal note, yes, that's me with hair. On a personal note, as wonderful an artist as Bearden was, he was an extraordinary activist and advocate on the behalf of other artists, on behalf of young curators, on behalf of young scholars. He would go over and beyond the call of duty, out of his way to champion them. He was a writer. He wrote an extraordinary book with Harry Henderson on African-American history and culture. And he was an absolute activist on behalf of the beauty and expansiveness and complexity of our culture. And it was a joy writing this book. Thank you.
I want Dr. Campbell to be my teacher. I want to take the next, I want to be here for all your lectures. I'm sure there are questions out in the room. So we have a little time. You'll take a few questions? Yes, over here on the left. The microphone is coming to you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Campbell.
Hello.
I'm Dr. Valerie Green-Amos, class of '93, Spelman College, and a Philadelphian.
Oh, okay, yes.
So I do need to ask you a question that came from Philadelphia. I understand you pronounce artist Romare Bearden.
Romare. Sometimes I slip and call him Romare, but the accurate pronunciation is Romare.
I would like you to help us understand that. And the reason why is that I recently purchased a book about Romare's work in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And I spoke to the bookseller about the pronunciation of his name. And he said, it's Romare. Mm-hmm. I said, it's not. So could you please elaborate on the pronunciation?
So I carefully researched that with his niece, who runs the Romare Bearden Foundation. Deirdre Harris Kelly manages that. Deirdre runs the foundation with her aunt, who was Nanette's sister, Sheila Rohan. So his family, I will tell you that his family thinks that his name is Romare.
Where can we find his art to look at in person?
So that's a good question. One of the realities of collage is that it's very fragile. The piece, The Block, is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's great, good news, right? The Metropolitan can only exhibit that piece every few years and only for a few months at a time. In order to conserve it, they had to put it, there are 4 panels, they had to put each of the 4 panels behind glass. But the Metropolitan Museum of Art has his work, the Museum of Modern Art has his work, the Whitney in New York has his work, the High Museum has that self-portrait, which is on view pretty much all the time, and the High is opening a show of his autobiographical profiles in the fall. Charlotte is probably the best place to see a lot of his work. The Mint Museum has a ton of his work, and there's actually a Bearden Park in Charlotte, which is absolutely charming. The Soul of a Nation, which is here in California, am I right? It's here in California now? Not yet?
Coming soon. Okay,
coming soon. Soul of a Nation has a group of his projections that open the show. Actually, his projections open the show, so you'll be able to see it when Soul of a Nation gets here.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for all the questions. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the context of the photo there.
What am I doing there?
Yeah,
Okay,
what
fine.
exactly is the meeting? What's going on?
So one of the things that, when I came to the Studio Museum in Harlem, one of the things that we tried to accomplish was to encourage more people to become collectors of African American art. And I am in the home of Ron Carter, the bass player, the jazz musician, and his wife, Janet Carter, who had an incredible collection of African American art. And we used to do the fine art of collecting. We're a seminar series that we used to host in her home. And on this particular day, I think I was introducing Mr. Bearden to speak about how people could go about and build a permanent collection. And back in those days, you could come to the Studio Museum in Harlem and go visit the artists in residence, and they'd sell you a piece for a few $100s. And these are now artists who are MacArthur Fellows and, Guggenheim Fellows and have retrospectives and all of that. So you actually could build an extraordinary collection of work back in those days.
Yes, here, down here, and then up there next.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So great to see you. This is an amazing book. I just want to encourage everyone, don't leave until you get the book.
Thank you.
But let me ask a question to give you an opportunity to talk about Bearden in St. Martin. And because I know that's part of the presentation, you didn't have time to do that. But just, could you also elaborate on the impact that had on his work and the connection with Nanette and the family, and just, was there a kind of a turning point with his relationship with St. Martin?
Yep. Really good question. I don't go into to St. Martin. I could do a whole slide presentation on St. Martin, but it was vital to his work. So a few years after Bearden was married, or maybe not a few, it was actually in the 60s, he and Nanette went to St. Martin, and it was his first trip, and he just fell in love with it. And if you've ever been there, it's just lush and gorgeous, and people speak to you, and it's just, and it reminded him a lot of Charlotte. It reminded him a lot of the South back when his great-grandparents were alive. And as Bearden became more stable economically, he finally resigned from his position as a caseworker, I think in 1966 or somewhere around there. He decided that he and Nanette were going to build a home there. And they did. They built a beautiful home, and then up further, he built a studio. And it looked out over the bay. It was just gorgeous. And you could immediately see the impact on his work. So the piece of the the nude and black silhouette nude and all the greenery around it, that's like around, I think like 1973 or so, something like that. Direct impact from his trip to St. Martin. And you begin to see that lushness, the flora, the fauna coming into his paintings much more. And at a certain point, he writes this beautiful article for the Sunday New York Times about what it meant to be there. And it's clear that he was getting weary. I mean, and I think that's exactly the right word, weary of being in New York, climbing the 5 flights up to his loft on Canal Street, and, you know, just the whole hassle of modern life. And he became more and more drawn to St. Martin and spent more and more time there. Yeah, thank you.
I know this question.
Do you think it's fair to say that Bearden's aesthetic and in like his total body of work is derived from the perspective of not so much that black is beautiful, but rather black has always been beautiful and will always continue to be beautiful?
So he has, part of the book are letters that he wrote when I was a graduate student, and I guess a few years after that as well. And he does talk about his need to reveal the beauty in the culture. And that's what August Wilson, I think, is saying in his passage. And the whole piece that Wilson wrote is really worth reading. It's in the, part of the foreword of a book on Bearden by Myron Schwartzman. So I would definitely recommend that you read what Wilson has to say. And I definitely agree, there's this unbelievable beauty, but there's also a kind of urge for him to be candid, to reveal what he sees, and so sometimes there's an almost, I won't say strident, but it is an extremely almost like raw quality in his work. Not often, but it's there. So I think I always like to say that he's trying to show the expansiveness and the complexity as well as the beauty. It's not only black is beautiful. Black is beautiful and it's complicated and it's contradictory and it's many, many things.
I wanted to pick up with the Wilson, August Wilson connection, and particularly Wilson's chronicle of African-American life in the 20th century, and so much of it being centered around the Hill District in Pittsburgh. Now, I understood you to say that Bearden spent a good bit of time, and the book talks about this. Bearden spent some time in Pittsburgh.
Yes, he did.
Can you elaborate on those connections and the possibility of the parallel telling of the story of African Americans across the 20th century, Wilson with his chronicling series of plays, and Bearden with his construction and representation of black life?
So I think when Wilson saw the Museum of Modern Art catalog, I think he saw that sweep from the south to the north, and he saw the different ways of being, that black culture manifests itself. I think he saw the richness. That's what he saw. What he marveled at was that Bearden was never reductive. He never simplified things. He was always trying to, represent them in their fullness, right? And so I think that was what Wilson was able to realize. I can do that. It's doable. Somebody has done it. He has done it. I think also the fact that in Bearden's work, there were these representations of Pittsburgh was a personal connection, because Bearden was there when he was like in the, 4th or 5th grade. And he made this friendship with this young boy who was, became a very close friend of his. And then he came back, he spent 2 years in high school there. And he began to work there as a young man in some of the positions in the steel mill. So he really got a feel for Pittsburgh, and it was a very different place from Harlem. You know, his mother lived in this apartment that Bertner Tandy had designed, you know, the architect, right, with velvet, you know, drapes and upholstered chairs. His grandmother and grandfather had a boarding house, and there were 30 men who would go out to the steel mills every day who lived in that boarding house. So he was looking at the life of African Americans from the point of view of working men who had come up from the South just to work, take some money back, you know, back home. So Wilson saw that Bearden got the differences, all the differences and as I said, you know, contrasts and contradictions that existed for us, and recognized that I can tell all of it. I don't have to stick to just some little part of it. I can tell all of it. And I think that was the significance of their connection. You know, Wilson never met him. He walked to his home at 357 Canal Street. He said he couldn't bring himself to ring the doorbell. So he said he took off his hat and just, you know, just paid his tribute and just walked on. And the thing is, if had he rung the doorbell, Bearden would have invited him right in, right?
A last question. Yes, right here. Here comes the mic.
Hi, this was a wonderful lecture, and I so appreciate all the nuances, the information that you gave us for, I want to say Romare, but it's, but I'm just wondering, in terms of nurture versus nature, he is such an artist. You said that he wrote lyrics, he had songs, he's a painter, he sees the world totally differently. He commands us to see the world differently in his art. But was there somebody in his family that was also artistic, be it like a barber or a,
That's a good question.
You know what I'm saying? Like
So,
a
yeah.
seamstress or some, I'm not,
Yeah.
you know, degrading, but there has to be something that, because this is an extraordinary gift.
No, it really is. We know that his great-grandfather did sketches, and his grandmother did too. They sketched. We know that his father was a very gifted pianist. His aunt taught piano. So they were musicians. So he did have that. But I think it's also, you know, he was surrounded by artists. I mean, his mother would hold, if County Cullen had a book of poetry coming out, she'd have a party for them. You know, she loved having the artists in their house. They were there, and so it kind of gave him permission to think that that's something I can do. Canada Lee, the great theater artist, was in their home. As I said, Fats Waller and Andy Razoff were in their home. So, I mean, he no matter where he turned, he was surrounded by Aaron Douglas, and his wife in turn had salons and would invite him to their homes, and they were very influential. You know, he happened to be raised in an incredibly rich soil. That's what I say. That was kind of the luck of the draw for him, that he was so surrounded by all these people. You know, Langston Hughes came to the home and brought Garcia Lorca there. I mean, you know, who gets to have that, you know, that kind of company on a regular basis, right?
Well, I want to thank you once again, Dr. Campbell, for this both inspirational and just such a rich and engaging opportunity to spend time with you this morning. I'm so glad that you left this picture of yourself with Romare Bearden here on the screen, because one of the great treats of the book, and somehow I didn't discover this until I got to the very end, are the facsimiles of the handwritten letters from the artists to our speaker today. And so it connects us even more deeply in time. And I think you convey that so incredibly beautifully. Thank you.